The sound of my father's leather belt hitting the kitchen table still echoes in my nightmares. Even 63 years later, that sharp crack would slice through the evening air like a whip, his signal that someone had displeased him, and my brother Jacob's heavy footsteps would come next, thundering down the hallway to drag me from wherever I was hiding. They worked together. You see, a perfectly choreographed dance of terror. Father would decide the punishment and Jacob would execute it. And I was just 8 years old, the first time I understood that the two doors in our Nebraska farmhouse didn't mean safety. They meant there were two different directions the violence could come from, and nowhere, absolutely nowhere to hide. My name is Eleanor Patricia Whitmore. I'm 71 years old, and I own 3 of the most successful bed and breakfasts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. If you're watching from Albuquerque or Taos or anywhere in the Southwest, you might have driven past my adobe buildings with their turquoise trim and thought, what a charming place, what a peaceful life that owner must have. But you'd never guess that the woman who built this empire from dust and Bafta's determination was once a terrified child in Lincoln, Nebraska, who learned that love and violence can wear the same face, that family can be your greatest danger, that survival sometimes means becoming someone entirely new. Write in the comments where you're watching from. Tell me your city, your state, because I want to know who's hearing this story I've kept locked inside for 7 decades. I want to picture your faces while I finally let these words out into the light. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though there was plenty of that. Bruises that I learned to hide under long sleeves even in August heat. A broken rib when I was 12 that father said was from falling off my bike. The worst part was the unpredictability, never knowing what would set him off. A glass of spilled milk, a B instead of an A on a spelling test, laughing too loud, being too quiet, existing too much or not enough. And Jacob, my older brother by 6 years, he absorbed father's rage like a sponge and wrung it out on me whenever father wasn't around to do it himself, like he was practicing to become the same kind of monster. And I was his training ground. I was born in 1954, right in the heart of America's golden age when everyone pretended everything was perfect. White picket fences and apple pies and Father Knows Best on television. But behind our door on Maple Street there was something rotten, something twisted that nobody talked about because you didn't air your dirty laundry. You kept your family business private. You smiled at church on Sunday and pretended the bruises were from being clumsy. My mother died when I was 7, pneumonia that took her in 3 days flat, and I remember standing at her funeral in my stiff, black dress, thinking that now there was nobody left to stand between me and father's temper, nobody to quietly redirect his attention. When his face started turning that particular shade of red that meant someone was about to suffer, she'd been the buffer, the lightning rod, and with her gone, the electricity had nowhere to go but straight into me. Father was a banker, Gerald Whitmore, pillar of the community, deacon at First Lutheran Church, Rotary Club member, the kind of man other men looked up to and wanted to be like. He wore 3-piece suits every day, kept his shoes shined to mirrors, spoke in this measured, careful way that made everything sound reasonable and right. At home he was different. At home the mask slipped and what lived underneath was cold and cruel and utterly convinced of his own righteousness, believed that beating obedience into children was not just acceptable but required, biblical even, spare the rod and spoil the child, he'd quote while Jacob held me down. The farmhouse we lived in belonged to my grandmother originally. Father inherited it when she passed in 1959, and we moved out there from our house in town because father said the city was corrupting, that we needed space and privacy and good, clean country air. What he really wanted was isolation, no neighbors close enough to hear anything, no witnesses to what happened behind closed doors. The house was built in that old prairie style, long and narrow with a central hallway and rooms branching off both sides. And my bedroom, God help me, had 2 doors. one to the main hall where father would appear like a dark shadow, and one to the back passage that led to the kitchen where Jacob would come from. And between the two of them, I never had a moment's peace, never felt safe, even in sleep. The violence had rules, father's rules, never the face where people could see, never hard enough to break bones unless it was an accident, never when there were guests in the house or before church on Sunday, always measured, always controlled, always with this terrible calm like he was performing surgery instead of hurting his own child. Jacob's violence was messier, angrier. He'd shove me into walls, twist my arm behind my back until I thought it would snap. Once he held my head under the water pump outside until I genuinely thought I was drowning. And when I came up gasping and crying, he laughed, said I needed to toughen up, said the world didn't care about crybabies. I tried to be perfect, tried to be invisible, tried to anticipate every possible thing that might displease them and avoid it. But perfection is impossible, and invisibility didn't work when they were actively looking for reasons. When the violence had become a habit, a need, something they did because they could, and because I was there, and because nobody was going to stop them. When I was 10, I told my teacher, Mrs. Henderson, that I was scared to go home, showed her the bruises on my arms where Jacob had grabbed me, and she looked at me with such pity and said, "Eleanor, sometimes fathers have to discipline their children. It's not for us to interfere with how a family handles their own business." And she never mentioned it again, and I never told another adult. Learned that the world would not save me, that I was on my own. The years crawled by in shades of fear and pain. I lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, always listening for footsteps, always watching their faces for signs of the storm coming, always calculating escape routes that didn't exist. School was my only refuge, the library where I could disappear into books and be someone else somewhere else, where Anne of Green Gables didn't have a father who used his fists like weapons and Nancy Drew solved mysteries. Instead of trying to figure out how to survive her own family, I stopped having friends because I couldn't have anyone over to the house, couldn't risk them seeing something, asking questions, and I couldn't go to their houses because father said I needed to be home doing chores. So I became that weird, quiet girl nobody really knew, and that was safer anyway, safer to be alone than to let anyone close enough to discover the truth. When I was 15, something happened that changed everything, not suddenly, but slowly, like a crack in a dam that eventually brings the whole thing down. Father had been drinking, which was rare but terrifying because alcohol made him unpredictable in new ways, made the violence wilder, less controlled. He came into my room through the main hall door around midnight, and I knew from his lurching walk that he was drunk, and he started yelling about something. I don't even remember what, grades or attitude or my mother's death being somehow my fault, and he had his belt in his hand, and I was cornered between my bed and the wall with nowhere to go. But then something in me snapped, some survival instinct stronger than fear. And when he swung that belt, I grabbed it, yanked it out of his hands, and I looked him straight in the eyes and I said, "No, not anymore, never again." And my voice didn't shake, didn't waver, and for just a second I saw something in his face I'd never seen before, uncertainty, maybe even fear, and he stumbled backwards and left the room without another word. That night I lay in bed shaking, terrified of what would come next, sure that I'd made everything worse, that tomorrow would bring retaliation beyond anything I'd experienced. But tomorrow came, and father acted like nothing had happened, and the next day and the next, and slowly I realized that something fundamental had shifted, that predators can sense when prey stops being prey, when the power dynamic changes. Jacob was a different problem. He didn't have father's instinct for didn't understand subtlety. And 2 weeks after my confrontation with father, Jacob came at me in the barn where I was feeding chickens, grabbed my hair and tried to slam my head against the wall like he'd done 100 times before. But this time I had a pitchfork in my hands, and I spun around and held the tines inches from his chest, and I said, Touch me again, and I will kill you. I swear to God I will end you. And I meant it, every word, and he saw that I meant it, and he backed away, and he never touched me again. And for those of you watching who've never had to threaten violence to stop violence, I hope you never understand that particular kind of desperation. But for those who do understand, you know exactly why I'm not sorry. The last 3 years of high school were different, not safe exactly but survivable. They left me alone mostly. We existed in this cold détente, where we barely spoke, barely acknowledged each other, and I counted down the days until graduation, like a prisoner counting days, until release. Had a calendar hidden under my mattress where I crossed off each day, 1,095 days, 1,094 days, 1,093 days, until freedom. Now let me ask you something, those of you watching from wherever you are, from your living rooms and offices and phones. Have you ever had to become someone you're not, just to survive? Have you ever drawn a line and said this far and no further, even when you were terrified? Tell me in the comments, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. Need to know that other people understand what it means to save yourself when nobody else will. I graduated in 1972, had saved every penny from babysitting jobs and helping at the general store, had almost $800 hidden in a coffee can buried under the porch steps, and the day after graduation I packed one suitcase, left a note saying I was going to college in California, and I got on a Greyhound bus headed west, and I never went back. Not once, not for anything. I ended up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, because the bus broke down there, and I was out of money, and it seemed like a sign. This high desert town full of artists and drifters, and people reinventing themselves. And I thought, I can reinvent myself too. I can become someone new, someone without all that history weighing her down. I changed my name, not legally at first, but just in practice. Started going by Patricia instead of Eleanor, used my middle name and my mother's maiden name Morrison, became Patricia Morrison. And that girl Eleanor Whitmore, the one who'd lived in fear for 17 years, I left her on that bus like a coat that didn't fit anymore. My first job was cleaning rooms at La Fonda Hotel on the plaza. Minimum wage and back-breaking work, but honest. And nobody hit me, nobody screamed at me. Nobody punished me for invisible infractions, and that alone felt like paradise. I worked doubles whenever I could, saved every cent, lived in a converted garage that cost $50 a month, and learned to make a meal out of rice and beans and whatever produce was cheap at the farmer's market. The other cleaning women were mostly Hispanic, spoke Spanish among themselves, but were kind to me in their way, and one of them, Rosa Gutierrez, took me under her wing, taught me Spanish, taught me how to make proper tortillas and green chili stew, treated me like the daughter she'd lost to cancer. And I'd never known that kind of maternal care, that gentle teaching without judgment. And sometimes I'd have to excuse myself and cry in the bathroom, because kindness hurt worse than violence when you weren't used to it. I watched how the hotel operated, studied it like a textbook, learned every aspect from housekeeping to front desk to management. And I had this hunger to understand, to master it, because I knew somehow that this was going to be my ticket to security, to building something that could never be taken away from me. By the time I was 20, I'd saved almost $15,000, lived like a monk, spent money only on absolute necessities. And when a small adobe house came up for sale near Canyon Road, needed work but had good bones and a desperate owner, I made an offer, got a small business loan to cover the rest, and I bought my first property. And standing in that empty house with the keys in my hand, I cried, just stood there and sobbed, because I owned something, had something that was mine, and mine alone, that nobody could use to hurt me. I spent the next year renovating that house myself, learned construction from library books and helpful hardware store employees, did everything from plastering to plumbing, and I made sure every single bedroom had 2 doors, made it a architectural feature, told people it was traditional New Mexican design for air circulation, but really it was my promise to anyone who stayed there. You always have another way out. You're never trapped. Neveri opened Casa Patricia in 1979, a small bed and breakfast with just 4 rooms, and I poured everything into making it beautiful and welcoming and safe. Fresh flowers in every room, homemade breakfast with blue corn pancakes and local honey, attention to every detail, and guests loved it. Started recommending it to friends. Travel magazines started mentioning us, and within 2 years I was profitable enough to buy a second property. The business grew steadily through the 80s and 90s. I opened 2 more bed and breakfasts, employed over 20 people, became known in Santa Fe as a fair boss and a sharp businesswoman, and I built this life from nothing, from terror and determination and absolute refusal to stay a victim. And nobody knew my real story. Nobody knew that Patricia Morrison was really Eleanor Whitmore, that the confident, successful woman they saw was built on top of a scared child who'd had to threaten her own brother with a pitchfork just to make it stop. In 1995, something happened that brought my past crashing into my present in the most unexpected way. I got a letter forwarded through my lawyer, the only connection I'd maintained to my old identity, and it was from a hospital in Lincoln, Nebraska, informing me that Gerald Whitmore was dying, lung cancer, maybe 3 months left, and he was asking for me, wanted to see his daughter before he died, wanted, the letter said, to make peace. I didn't go, threw the letter away and tried to forget about it, but it haunted me, this idea that he wanted to make peace, like peace was something he had any right to ask for, like dying gave him some kind of absolution, and I was angry, furious actually, that even dying he was trying to take something from me, trying to force me into the role of forgiving daughter in his final act. He died 6 weeks later, and I didn't go to the funeral either, but I did something else, something that still confuses me. I sent flowers, a huge expensive arrangement, and the card said, "From Eleanor, may you find in death the peace you never allowed in life." And I don't know if that was forgiveness or revenge or just my way of saying, I survived you. I'm still here, and you're gone. Jacob, I never heard from directly, but through occasional internet searches over the years I pieced together his life. He'd married, had kids, got divorced, worked a series of dead-end jobs, had some run-ins with the law, drunk and disorderly, assault charges that were dropped, and I saw in his mugshot the same rage that used to terrify me, now directed at the world instead of just at me, and I felt nothing really. Just a distant sort of pity for whoever had to deal with him now. I'm 71 years old now, sitting on the portal of my original bed and breakfast, watching the sunset paint the Sangre de Cristo Mountains gold and purple, and I have built something beautiful from something terrible. I have 3 successful businesses. I have employees who've been with me for decades. I have guests who return year after year and tell me my houses feel like home, like safety. And they have no idea how literal that is, how every choice I made in designing these spaces came from remembering what it felt like to be trapped. Those 2 doors that used to mean danger, now mean choice, mean freedom, mean that nobody in my houses will ever feel the way I felt. And maybe that's my real victory, not that I escaped but that I transformed the weapon into a shield, turned my trauma into other people's sanctuary. I never married, never had children, and people assume that's sad, that I must be lonely, but I chose this, chose solitude over the risk of ever being vulnerable again, chose independence over the gamble of trusting someone with that much power over my life, and I don't regret it, not for a second, because I built this empire alone, every brick and beam of it, and it's mine in a way that nothing was ever mine in that Nebraska farmhouse. Sometimes guests ask me about the 2 doors, ask if it's really a traditional design element or if there's a story there, and I smile and say, it's about always having choices, always having options. And they nod like they understand, but they don't. Not really. They don't understand that those doors are my autobiography written in architecture, my manifesto in wood and adobe, my promise that what happened to me won't happen to anyone else if I can help it. My name is Eleanor Patricia Whitmore Morrison. I'm 71 years old, and I turn two doors of terror into dozens of doors of freedom. And if one person watching this understands that survival is possible, that you can transform your worst experiences into your greatest strengths, that time and distance and sheer stubborn determination can turn a victim into a victor, then maybe all of it meant something. Thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing witness to this story I've carried alone for so long. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories of women who refused to let their past write their future. And remember, there's always another door, always another choice. Even when the walls feel like they're closing in forever, you are not trapped, you are not powerless. You are stronger than you know.